so much for being with us. Good morning. Honorable Minister, Srimati Smriti Zubin Irani, Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, Chandraprabha Saikyani Center for Women's Studies is glad to welcome you today on this day of Tilottoma Barooah's death anniversary. Ma'am, it's a real privilege actually to have you with us in this form to actually celebrate the glory of these two significant Assamese women, Tilottoma Barooah and Hemlata Barooah, who have contributed immensely to the women's empowerment and social justice in the beginning of the 19th century. You are, ma'am, one of the strongest voices of the nation and also the leader of Women's Empowerment Mission in India. You are inspiration for all of us. We see the women's movement that was born in India, in despite of many efforts, what we see today is that we had international years and decades and the efforts of the women organizations, but the social attitudes are yet to change. Ma'am, we would like to interact with you and also like to just get your mind regarding these issues and challenges that confront the Indian woman today in form of questions and answers. Ma'am, can I start?
Please do. Thank you so much for this invitation.
My first question to you is, what are the new forces of transformation that you see in the society today?
The question that should, in fact, help us reflect on this is that truly how much apart from technology has society seen transformation? If you look at the cultural context of India and our civilizational values, we have always held as a civilization women as equal to men. After many invasions in our country, this issue about protecting women, putting them behind a parda, or for that matter, this issue of emancipation of women, especially in democratic India, became a mainstream agenda of debate and deliberation. Today, under the Prime Minister's leadership, I see a tectonic shift in the narrative. Many years, our governments at the center have consistently maintained that women needed emancipation. But Narendra Modi changed the narrative and said, if the country has to grow, in the development of the country, you need women to be equal partners. And that is why the agenda of governments earlier was women's development. And now Prime Minister Modi says that we need to ensure women-led development. And women will be in a position to lead development of our nation state when they themselves are equipped with education, financial means, when they are secure enough to ensure that they contribute holistically to the growth of our society and nation at large. And that is why today, when you ask me what are the transformative avenues or indications that I see in society, I think one of the greatest levelers from a gender equity perspective is technology. It brings us platforms of deliberation where everybody has a voice, has an opinion. It gives us great impetus to research on issues which we may have limited knowledge of. It also becomes a great resource for ensuring that our point of view is heard by a larger audience. You will possibly join cause with me and recognize that when it comes to Indian women, their backgrounds, their legacies, or for that matter, their contribution or the way forward that they choose for themselves, contextually from the Western world, not much is spoken about us. Today, you invite me to this program dedicated to Tilottoma Barooah ji. How many in the West may know of her contribution? Let alone the West, how many, let's say, in North India know about her contribution? Or the South of India know of her contribution? So what technology does is becomes a transformational tool to ensure that our narrative is heard, to ensure that we hear new perspectives and gain a worldview which was possibly earlier limited. And it also ensures that women who have led from the front in our smallest villages, towns, or regions that have not been propagated before, their stories now come to the fore.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. My next question would be, since we have been in universities, we have been working on, say, we have certain parameters and we have a mandate of doing research and extension activities. So that's one problem also where you are not able to reach the common people. For example, the rural women. So ma'am, how do you see this category of women in the development paradigm?
I think it's ironical when universities and academia are limited to a mandate or have a Maryada Rekha drawn around them. Because if you look at the beauty of academics or the purpose of research, it is to be limitless. However, limitations are drawn due to the paucity of resources or the desire to use resources judiciously. There is one prejudice that we have in our thought. We presume that it's only rural women who may have not heard these stories, which means that we limit these stories to a particular geographical landscape. These stories need to be heard in rural and urban geographical areas of our country. The other limitation that we draw upon ourselves is that only rural women have to hear these stories. My belief is men and young boys also need to hear of them. And when you have a context where stories of women become stories of inspiration and not get limited only to femalehood, I think a lot can be expanded on the contribution of women. Historically, when stories of men and their contribution was to be told, those stories were not limited to young men or boys or men alone. Those stories were told far and wide. We are today in the Azadi Ka Amrit Kal, where we celebrate, come together for 75 years of our independence. Look back. How many of us know of the women who have contributed to the making of the Constitution? How many of us have glorified the role of women who have contributed to the freedom movement locally? Almost everybody will talk of Jhansi Ki Rani.
Yes.
Many now, because of the efforts of the Prime Minister to attract attention to the Northeast and its contribution, talk about, let's say, Rani Gaidanlu. However, how many of us contextualize the local relevance of women who have contributed to the freedom struggle, if not even going into history? Today, they are female academic leaders, scientists, accountants, doctors, lawyers. Forget about the state or the nation. How many of us celebrate their potential in their own home districts? How many home districts have celebrated when a female has received a Padma Award?
Yes.
So I think that, yes, academic research is something that happens within a limited purview. Its intent is to dig deep and find details which nobody, suffice to say, would take the trouble to find. It is incumbent upon us to make sure that these relevant measures are conveyed effectively to people, irrespective of their genders or geographical boundaries. However, we need to ensure that those women who contribute now, those women who excel now, let not leave it to history to celebrate them.
Yes. Sure. Thank you, ma'am. My next question would be, I would like to talk about the new education policy, which focuses on the girl education and gender sensitization. And on the other side, we have this vulnerability of the girl child in our societies. So, ma'am, how is your ministry going to look at this?
The Prime Minister was extremely insistent on ensuring that the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao campaign becomes a Jan Andolan, which it has. Child sex ratio at birth has improved tremendously under the program. For the first time in the history of our policy making, Gender Inclusion Fund now has been added to the national education policy. However, we need to see, how do you go beyond the rules that are already defined for women? We always talk about more and more inclusion of women in the teaching staff. I would like to see more and more women as academic leaders of institutions, as management leaders of institutions. Women lead in decisions that monetarily affect an academic institution. Women lead when it comes to assignment of HR policies in an institution. Women lead in the hiring processes, because that's where the real power is. Similarly, I think that when you talk about the education policy, there is a need to ensure that scientific methodologies of study, of analysis, of research are now more and more available in local languages. There is a huge challenge when it comes to women and local languages and the unavailability of instruments which are academic in nature and technological in nature in local languages. We have a lot of loss of talent because of it. And that is why the Prime Minister's insistence that the new education policy ensure that academia now can flourish in local languages is of great importance.
Right. I would also like to take your take on, since women's studies was also a part of the women's movement, and looking at the status of women's studies centers in India, which is really very deplorable, I would say. What is your take on that, ma'am, since you belong to this Ministry of
When I
Women?
was Minister Education under
Yes,
UGC,
ma'am.
I did make an effort to ensure that the women's studies cell in all universities are reactivated. Given the fact that our institutions are autonomous in nature, it has been particularly of disappointment to me that the men who led these institutions did not allow the women's study centers to flourish.
Yes.
And I think that is why it is incumbent upon well meaning men and women to come together to strengthen these systems within universities. Because I feel that when I talk about women and academia and women's studies, they always somehow gravitate to home science. And I am at a loss for words as to why would such a particular center not thrive with potential of science, not thrive with new academic research prospects, not thrive with inter-institutional exchanges with students from overseas. So, given that constitutionally there is a limitation as to how much you can impose upon an academic institution, I think it's time that men who are leading these academic institutions recognize the importance of women's studies.
Okay. That's a message that goes to all the universities in India, for that matter, from the minister herself. Since it was in the Towards Equality report, which came out in 1974 by Professor Nurul Hasan, who himself was a sociologist, and this particular community, this was a committee of the status of women of India then, and there were a lot of things that were put inside the draft. And if we see the present times, we see as if we are raising the same concerns that were raised in, say, 71 to 74, the issues of discrimination, the issues of, say, women's education, women's health, and things like that. So, I mean, what is, as a university person, as a teacher, I would like to know that what is your take on this? That is it that we are, going back and we're not, though there are ample evidences where we see that, yes, we have moved in, but no, not that much.
I think
The
that
statistics is very...
there are two parts to your question, which I would like to answer. Firstly, when you talk about a sociological paper on the status of women in India, are there any sociologically evidenced foundations which are Indian in context? Most of sociology is informed from Western ideology. They are not informed by the Indian ethos. Anybody who's a sociology student will recognize that you will study about Weber, you may study about Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yes.
How many of you know the sociological context of a country as diverse as ours? Let's see language again. When you talk about linguistics and its impact on society at large, most of our references are either from Russian or European sociologists.
Right.
If we look at the impact on media and cultural context from a sociological perspective, many of us still teach the Chicago school
Yes.
or the Frankfurt school. So when you talk about a paper which talks about status of women, what is the reference or the sociological foundation in terms of theory for that paper? None of it is from the Asian subcontinent perspective. So if you look at anthropology, if you look at sociology, if you look at psychology, they all have a Western context.
Yes.
Your second part is, are we still fighting with discrimination? Well, discrimination is not something which is attuned to a particular class. Discrimination is not something which is wedded to a particular race or a particular gender. It is in continuum always. But what can we see today that did not happen, let's say, in the 1960s? In the 1960s or 70s, when that paper was written or pondered over, you did not have 26 weeks of paid maternity leave for women in our country, legislatively confirmed. Today, that is a reality. In the 1970s, you did not have a scheme like Mudra, where 70% beneficiaries for small-scale industry or enterprise received credit, and these were all women. You did not have the startup revolution in the 70s, where schemes like Stand Up India saw 80% women as beneficiaries. You did not have 25 crore women suddenly have a bank account for themselves. So there is much that has happened. Why is it that it is never referenced or evidenced? Because the parameters per se have never conformed to our way of life. So let's say that we talk about an issue called breaking the glass ceiling. That was never a part of our movement in our country. Why? Because women in our country, when our constitution was democratically born, had an equal right to vote as men. The suffragette movement took place in the West, did not take place here.
Right.
So many a time we use idioms, we use proverbs, we use quotations without even knowing the context of it. And even if you look at so-called feminist revolutionaries like Gloria Steinem, her second book, which she published, spoke about the flaws from her first position. That her first position was that I was devoid of the impact of family and society, now I stand corrected. And every time I am asked, are you a feminist? I say, no, I'm a humanist. Because by defining myself as feminist, I am proclaiming that I'm prejudicial to other genders.
Okay. Right. Very, very rightly said and very rightly said. Ma'am, this is because why we need to do this is because since the starting of the women's studies, the way the pedagogy that's there, so we always rely on, say, the Western perspective. So that has always been there because this was the idea.
How is it that our universities in 6 decades have not been able to define our perspective?
Yes, because there's absolutely no, as if there is absolutely no Indian feminism and it's Western feminism. And this is where it's very...
Being an Indian means that you're a humanist.
Right.
Indians have never been taught, be a feminist or be pro-men. Indians have always been taught, the world is your family.
Right. This is exactly Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam that we talk about. Ma'am, my next question is that since this is pertaining to Northeast India, the issue of migration and human trafficking, women trafficking, particularly that we see, that the situation in the last decade, I would say, has become very deplorable. Because we are not able to, even after the 56, 86 amendments, we could see that, there's not much of a change. And it's still there in the pockets. In tea gardens and various other places also, we see that's very rampant. So how is that we are going to be, how can we be a little bit more stringent regarding this particular issue? And we are not doing much studies, only the NGOs are doing it.
No, I think that is again a prejudicial view. Because in the first effort that the Prime Minister made was the judicious use of the Nirbhaya Fund. From 2013, when the fund was announced by the erstwhile Congress government, in 2014, before Narendra Modi took office, not a penny was spent from the Nirbhaya Fund. Post Narendra Modi taking office, 9,000 crores worth of funding projects were evaluated. Today, every district has an anti-human trafficking unit, which has been established by the ministry in collaboration Ministry of Home. Today, 704 districts have one-stop crisis centers. And we have 35 women's helpline. Between the two, in the past 2.5, 3 years, 70 lakh women have been helped. Today, you have a collaboration between my ministry and that of NIMHANS on issues of mental health for children and women who are victims of violence. We have, through the Nirbhaya Fund, funded rapid transport safe systems for women in major metros. We have funded establishment of women help desks across all police stations. We have funded many an infrastructure projects, which includes giving forensic kits to various police establishments across the country. So these conversations, I think, possibly help highlight these contributions and these efforts. I have never claimed that this will be a utopian state where there will be no crime, because that is not a possibility for humanity. But what you can work towards is to ensure that our police systems, our administrative systems respond fast to the needs of women. A trafficking bill has been under works and has now been presented for its final say by the cabinet. And we have consistently ensured that our engagement with state governments is robust to help secure the lives and livelihoods of women. You are aware that law and order is a state issue. Hence, constitutionally given our mandate, we engage appropriately with state governments who have consistently maintained their dedicated efforts to saving and safeguarding the rights of women.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. My next question is, and maybe I'm just going to wind up to this also. There will be one more important question is regarding the sexual harassment of women in workplace. That was something very important bill that came in 2013. Now, this also has been instituted almost in all the organizations, institutions in India. But still we say somewhere or the other, there always has been a lackadaisical attitude of the employers or say the people who are there in the committees to work towards it. So ma'am, can there be a more, I don't say that there has to be a very stringent law.
It's not very stringent. I think what you have very rightly said is the lackadaisical attitude of citizens. So how does the citizenry change? It is by civilians saying that correct the course. Normally, it is easy to blame the polity or the legislative. Here, it is ironical that the legislative has done its job. It is the citizens, the employers who need to now respond.
Yes, ma'am, very rightly said. I will come to the last question of this beautiful interaction with you, ma'am. That women's history has always been silent about the women's contribution to the society. And the women's studies centers in India are slowly trying to work towards documenting, making women's archives so that, the lesser known history, the history which has been somewhere there in, the debris is slowly, we are trying to, because these are the women who are unrecognized. These are the women, there were a lot of women, because they're not in history, we don't know about them. They were only a minuscule number that was there. But now, with like the history of Himlata Barooah, the history of Tilottoma Barooah, and many more. Our center is named after Chandrababa Soigani Center for Women's Studies. Chandrababa Soigani herself was a rebel and a women's rights crusader. Ma'am, I would like to ask you whether your ministry has any such, I won't say policy, but an initiative where we are, we can at least go for an archive or say documentation that we do, an archive on the Indian level and a pan-Indian level, where at least the women from this part of India are also known.
Unfortunately, my ministry does not have the constitutional mandate to do this, hence my limitation. Nor does it get the funds to do these kind of projects. Constitutionally, this is the mandate of the Ministry of Culture, which is looking at the contribution of women in our independence movement and otherwise. However, I take a very polite exception for you using the term women's history. History is genderless. If we do not serve the cause of women in history, then it is we as people who are to blame, not history.
Yes.
When we divide history on gender, we do a great disservice to the fact that women's history then becomes a silo, which is to be treated independent of history. So if you want to seriously give ode or pay homage to history and women's roles in it, I think we need to start by saying there's nothing called women's history. It is history, and we need to nudge around to make sure that women had their rightful place in it.
Yes. Ma'am, that's very true. But somewhere, where these like, for example, Tilottoma Barooah and Hemlata Barooah, who had worked in the 90s, and they were not known of the important contributions and the way they had led a group of women.
So when we say we only will do women's history, then it becomes again this small tight-knit group that will keep talking to each other about these issues. It does not become popular history.
Mm-hmm.
So our intention should be to make sure that it's popular history. And that is only possible when we start recognizing the gaps in recorded history and why are women missing from history.
Yes, yes, that's an important point. Ma'am, how do you see this contributions of Tilottoma Barooah and Hemlata Barooah? And how do you see that, how were they different from the kind of, work the present day women, say, activists or the women leaders are doing?
I think that Tilottoma Barooah's mainstay was education and a recognition that transformation in society is possible only when you engage in the basis of education, I think is one of the most poignant contributions of Tilottoma Barooah. The fact that she did not want to limit herself only to education, that she had an expansive talent from classical dance onwards to sports, meant that this is an indication to society at large, which feel that women get defined only by one aspect of that persona. The fact that she was multifaceted, yet grounded, and wanted to contribute, I think speaks volumes about her persona.
Right. And ma'am, Hemlata Barooah, whom we are going to confer the award this year,
I think that one of the greatest tributes we can pay, both to Tilottoma Barooah and Hemlata Barooah, is to find how many such women have yet been unsung.
Yes.
Who are the women who worked with them? Can we start with them? Can we start naming them and their contribution? Let alone look at other women across the state. Can we look at the women who worked with them and find resonance of their work in women today? So if we can bridge and find a link between the past and the present, I think that will be one of the greatest contributions to even Hemlata Barooah.
This is exactly what Chandraprabha Saikyani Center for Women's Studies is doing right now, has taken up this as a mandate for collecting and documenting the histories of the women who are unknown and to see what kind of strategies they had actually taken up in their lives after leading a very, there were a lot of struggles in their lives, and after that also they did. I am so thankful on behalf of Tezpur University. I thank Ma'am Minister that you were there, and I see that one day you will be there for us, because students, they were very enthusiastic that ma'am, you will be there. So I will tell them that this is what ma'am has given you. So for the time being, this is what from your side, and I hope that one day you will be here in this university to be amidst us.
I look forward to being in the university soon. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.